No world leader ever had so much power.
He was a cold-blooded Machiavellian.
But by 1966, Chairman Mao was losing his grip.
The madness that he saw in China.
There was only one way out. He must destroy China, to remake China, to save China. His weapon was a fanatical youth movement acting to the tenets of his Little Red Book. Mao would also shock the world by making a covert deal with his arch-enemy.
What we do here change the world.
This is the story of the leader who unleashed huge change on his people. It is the story of a man who was the son of a peasant farmer, who ended his life as a god in his vast country. This is Mao, declassified. China, 1965. Chairman Mao Zedong, the supreme leader of Communist China, was being discreetly eased from power.
Mao, in the early 60s, found himself in a power struggle against people who were much more pragmatic than him, who didn't have such an extreme vision of collectivization of agriculture, of industry, of all life.
Recently disclosed information shows that the leaders of China were arguing over how best to move beyond the failing economic policies of Chairman Mao.
Mao had probably one of the most extreme visions, short of Pol Pot in Cambodia, of the collectivization of everything. No private property. People live in houses that are owned by the state. They eat in canteens run by the state. They work for the state. This wasn't working very well. Mao was basically put out of power in the early 60s. He was sort of sidelined.
Ejecting Mao from power was difficult. He was, after all, the pole star of the Chinese Revolution.
Mao's contribution to China, such as it was to genuinely unify the country, which it hadn't been for at least 150 years, to set it in a national direction.
In very simple terms, Mao had come in as a charismatic revolutionary leader, and his role in the Long March and the victory over the Kuomintang was epic. He was a guerrilla fighter. He was a leader. What he couldn't do was to run a country.
In China, from the 1920s all the way through to 1949, there was no leader like Mao Zedong. His military victories were breathtakingly successful, and his ability to inspire the people was electrifying.
Mao Zedong came to power in the 20s, organizing peasants in Hunan, the south of China, and launched this whole new kind of revolution. He sort of stood Marx on his ear. Instead of workers, he organized a revolution with peasants.
Mao's communist forces won major battles against his rival for control of China, Chiang Kai-shek, and also against the invading forces of the Imperial Japanese Army.
Slowly that movement gathered momentum, and ultimately, largely I think because of the Japanese occupation of China, where Mao and his guerrillas did fight the Japanese, whereas Chiang Kai-shek didn't.
Mao outfought the nationalists and the Japanese invaders and established the communist revolution in China. The nationalists were forced off the mainland entirely, to the island of Taiwan, where they remain to this day.
And he came to power in 1949 with an enormous sense of hope that this country would be rejuvenated after a very sort of corrupt period of governance by Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. But very quickly, much of that hope turned sour.
Mao turned for help to his obvious ally in the communist world, the Soviet Union.
And the first thing he does is to link up to the Soviet Union and buy into their economy. I mean, anybody could have told him, don't follow the Soviet model. He does everything the Soviets do. Central planning, government ownership of the means production, single-party control.
For the Soviet leaders, Mao offered the perfect opportunity to massively expand their brand of communist revolution. China would be their strong right arm in Asia.
They crank out tanks, MiG aircraft, AK-47s. China gets armed. They fight us to a draw in Korea, but the Soviets begin to lean on the Chinese. They begin to tell them what to do. And the Chinese come to the Soviets and ask for nuclear weapons, and Khrushchev says, never. I'll never give you guys weapons.
China and the Soviet Union finally parted company in 1962. Mao would never permit China to be less than a full and equal partner in the revolution, and Khrushchev would never entrust Mao with the atomic bomb.
The system wasn't working very well. Mao says, I'll take care of it. And this is when it's either the arteries are shrinking in his head, his blood to his brain, or whatever it is, he comes up with this lunatic social engineering called the Great Leap Forward.
In 1958, Mao inaugurated the Great Leap Forward to bring about rapid economic advances through the creation of giant communes. Farmers were ordered to stop farming and make steel. Famine was the immediate result.
He wanted to be able to produce more steel than England, for example. Part of the things that was practiced almost everywhere was people in colleges, universities, in factories, in villages give up whatever their normal daily activity was and started to forge steel.
Coinciding with a series of bad harvests, the Great Leap Forward became a disaster of epic proportions. Many experts think that as many as 20 million people died in the famine. Others put the number at 30 million. It may possibly be the worst famine in the history of mankind.
It became evident that unchecked power, such as Mao had and aspired to have, was pretty bitter medicine for China. But he nonetheless unified China. He drove out Chiang Kai-shek. He helped drive out the foreigners. He restored China to a certain dignified, if somewhat extreme, position in the world.
Mao was unwilling to admit making mistakes. The rise of more pragmatic leaders was a threat to him. Careful study of declassified documents reveals the clandestine power struggles inside the Chinese government hierarchy.
In come the so-called revisionists, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and they start to try to get China to run again. They import turnkey plants from Europe. They begin to deal with Japan for economic assistance. Mao sits down there and plots. He says, this is crazy. This is killing the revolution. They're bringing in bourgeois liberalism. This is deadly. And he plots the Cultural Revolution. He says, I'm going to clean all those guys out. I'm going to get them.
Mao saw a last chance to hold on to power. He plotted a secret gambit in which he would dismantle China in order to save it. But was he saving the land for the people or for himself? The era of permanent revolution was about to begin, all over again. China, 1960. After leading his country through a successful war for independence and a communist revolution, Chairman Mao Zedong instituted policies that resulted in famine and economic disaster. He feared, with some justification, that his political rivals were secretly preparing to remove him from power.
In the 1960s, Mao was everything in China to the people, not in terms of the inner workings of the Politburo, which is the ruling committee of the Communist Party. He had actually lost his power, and he was being shoved aside by the top Politburo members because they didn't agree with his policies.
There have been many powerful and charismatic leaders in communist history, but none has been so convinced of the doctrine of permanent revolution to prevent the establishment of new and corrupt elites as Mao Zedong. This was also the tool he would use to re-establish his own authority over the party.
Very interestingly, they thought they could sideline Mao by making him an icon, just sort of an empty icon, and that would satisfy people's spiritual needs. That was a big strategic mistake because it allowed Mao to then retake control of the country.
Mao needed the particular help of one person, a woman he had neglected for years after their marriage soured, and who had spent a decade very ill because of cancer. She was his wife, Jiang Qing, also known as Madame Mao.
Jiang Qing, Mao's fourth wife, was a former movie actress, very vain, who Mao had sort of, I think, gone cold on. She was jealous, she was venal, she was ambitious, and she took over culture.
Jiang Qing was a woman who didn't seem to have any friends. She was taut and uptight and very bad-tempered. She ordered people around, she was merciless, and she was completely humorless. Well, Jiang Qing remembered exactly who did not approve of her marriage to Mao, and she got it back during the Cultural Revolution in spades. She made sure those people died.
It would take many years for the secrets about Madame Mao's revenge to be finally disclosed. At the time, most people saw her as a devoted wife.
At the beginning, of course, they're lovers. Mao was the guerrilla leader, and she was the most beautiful young lady available in Yan'an. Mao was the most powerful guerrilla leader. As a tradition, women of China, we were told since we were young that we were lesser human beings. We were grass. Women were grass, born to be stepped on.
Madame Mao changed that iniquity for a while, and by the time she was done with the men who had stepped on her, many of them were dead.
She was the messenger of Mao. In her own words, during her trial, and I think that that's very much a self-portrait. She said, I'm Mao's dog, right? When Mao asked me to bite, I bit.
She had long ago fallen out of love with him, but Madame Mao still wanted the power Chairman Mao represented.
Mao would have had a showdown in China in the 60s, Jiang Qing or no Jiang Qing. I believe it would not have been a cultural revolution, and Mao would not have called it a cultural revolution, but for his wife. Her field was culture. She was a former actress, and she had been in Shanghai on the stage and in films.
Madame Mao was the ideal instigator of Mao's new revolution, a cultural revolution. She started with a series of attacks on artists who were seen as liberal or revisionist.
The first act of the Cultural Revolution was indeed to announce politicization of the arts, and Jiang Qing was put in charge of this with the title of artistic advisor to the army.
Madame Mao set out to remake Chinese culture for the revolution. Old feudal Chinese art, like the classical operas, were considered bad and reactionary. Western art was even worse.
Feudal culture, old culture was bad because it was a symbol of the oppressive classes before the revolution. Revolutionary culture was good, and she narrowed it down to a handful of operas and ballets, which people saw over and over and over again. The Red Detachment of Women I mean, it was a kind of magnificent kitsch socialist spectacle, but finally very boring. And this was what culture was.
The news stories were all about brave revolutionaries fighting the capitalists. Traditional music and dance were replaced with the staccato of machine gun fire and martial poses.
She brainwashed the entire nation with her propaganda films. 10 years, we were allowed nothing, no art from any other countries except her own propaganda film, which is she makes one film a year and forced 1 billion people to watch that, especially children. And after that, we didn't know anything else. The image to me was that to carry the grenade and tie the grenade on my body like the hero in those movies. That to sacrifice myself, to die for world revolution, to die for Mao. And she succeeded.
One of the central tenets of Jiang Qing's career during Cultural Revolution was to try to make her into the image of the Red Empress. She's the perfect female communist leader. At the time, of course, this ideal required a sense of near puritanical purity. Unfortunately, Jiang Qing in her early days, prior to going to Yan'an and meeting Mao, has had affairs, several affairs, some of them with married men. So she spent considerable time and used her considerable influence during the Cultural Revolution to track down people who knew this part of her history.
Behind this initiative was the hidden hand of the master. Mao was maneuvering the pieces into place quietly. His wife, Madame Mao, had struck the first blow. The propaganda war was won, and the real one was about to start. Before it did, Mao had to raise an army of children. As fanatical teenagers, they would bring China to its knees. The momentum generated by Madame Mao's propaganda attacks enabled Mao to summon the army he would need to bring down party bosses like Deng Xiaoping, whom he deeply distrusted.
Mao means everything to me. Mao was our universe, our God. And there was nothing else but to follow him. I was taught to write "Long Live Chairman Mao" before I was taught to write my own name. Mao said, the most important thing about the Cultural Revolution is to identify who are our friends and who are our enemies.
In Mao's philosophy, the people's enemy was the landlord, the rich farmer, the intellectual, the bureaucrat, and naturally the West. For him personally, the enemy also included the old Communist Party of China that he himself had built but no longer controlled.
Many people rushed to streets to smash store signs because the revolutionaries said there were a lot of store names that indicated old ideas, old culture, old habit, old custom. For example, Great Prosperity Market. Prosperity hinted at making money. Making money was bad. And a theater near my home was called Peace Theater. Well, that's no good. So they changed it to Revolution Theater.
Mao vilified his political opponents when they didn't actively support his policies. If the party newspaper didn't print an editorial he had written or endorsed, he broadcast directly to the people that their chairman was being victimized.
This gave Mao an even greater excuse to say, look, you know, the revolutionary ideas are being pushed aside, etc., etc. And he literally said, there is a second center of power, and they're against me, and they're trying to suppress the people. This, of course, got the student quite riled up. So several universities in Beijing, the students simultaneously organized, and that's how the Red Guard was born. Of course, very quickly, it spread nationwide, and it spread to middle schools and even grammar schools.
He was putting pressure on his opponents, and then he said young people should rebel. He said it is right to rebel. And so the young people, they all said, well, let's rebel.
Firstly, Mao directed his young followers to attack the most fundamental institution after the family. They were encouraged to destroy their schools.
Because, of course, all young people want to rebel, and there they were getting the stamp of approval from the icon that they had all worshipped. They didn't know that he had lost his power, so they started attacking their teachers and their principals. They started burning books because it was a cultural revolution, so all the old culture was out the window.
When the Cultural Revolution started, schools stopped completely. There was no schools. Instead of studying, we were told to do revolutionary tasks. We brought in big pieces of white paper and used brush to write articles after articles, to attack teachers, to attack school leaders, to attack educational system. For years, we did not have a school.
Mao co-opted another important ally at that moment, a man he would one day name as his successor, and a man who would one day betray him. This man was Lin Biao, the head of the army.
Lin Biao was a very successful military strategist during the war, both in the war against the Japanese as well as the Civil War. He was widely recognized as a military genius, including his enemies.
With Lin Biao as Mao's close ally, the army was secure. Lin Biao created something special for his troops to continually boost their morale. A little red book of Mao's teachings.
Lin Biao heavily promoted this as a way of, I think, probably to show his loyalty toward Mao. And this became a huge phenomenon. Essentially, at the time, all the people in China were required to memorize as much possible from this little book. They have to carry it with them all the time. It's almost like a Bible to a very, very devoted religious zealot.
It was the indispensable item that the young devotees of the Red Guard carried, and it contained all the political and doctrinal answers they needed. When the Red Guards saluted Mao, they did so with the little red book.
At the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, Chairman Mao went to Tiananmen Square 8 times and received 11 million Red Guards. You know, back then, to see Chairman Mao in person was the dream for almost everyone, including myself. Chairman Mao allowed the Red Guards to travel around the country for free to lead revolutionary fire. So millions of them went to Beijing by train, by bus, even walk for months, and waited at the Tiananmen Square for days. When finally Chairman Mao showed up, they were so excited. It was a dream coming true.
The Red Guards were not merely dedicated to spreading the word of the revolution. They were trained fighters and expected to participate in combat if necessary. Before the Cultural Revolution ended, there were many deaths, perhaps as many as 1 million.
I would have a target with the American soldier's helmet on it, and every morning in the dark, like 4 o'clock, I'll get up with leaders from other school, and the military instructor will coach us. And with this gun, with a bayonet on it, I go, shah, shah. And you have to envision, you have to go, shah, and make sure you see the intestines fall out. If you don't, he's going to do that to you. Today, I'm happily married to a former U.S. Marine, a Vietnam veteran, an English teacher. The day when we got married, he said, I hope I don't have flashbacks. And I said, I hope I don't have flashbacks.
In the late 1960s, young people all over the world started attacking their parents, their institutions and their governments. Only in China did the father of the country realize that his government could use the radical anger of youth for its own ends.
The demonstrations, the Red Guards, the destroying of their old culture, the harassment of people, the elimination of their leadership class, vicious times in China.
The world was turned upside down. August 1966, Mao unleashed the Red Guards. These young people would attempt to destroy traditional Chinese culture, humiliate intellectuals and landowners, and indulge in savage behavior, ranging from the beating of their own parents to the mass slaughter of political opponents. The firestorm had begun. China, 1967. Chairman Mao Zedong had created a cult of personality around himself, with the aid of his wife Jiang Qing, his chief of the army Lin Biao, and hundreds of thousands of Red Guards. These young people were ready to tear the country apart at Mao's command. The chairman wanted them to break up the Communist Party so that he could reform it himself.
And he started attacking the party, saying it was corrupt, it was bureaucratic, it was stultifying, it needed to be swept away, and the revolution needed to transcend this old structure that he himself had built. But it was also an attack against intellectuals, against anyone who was, quote, expert. He said you should be read, not expert. You didn't need to know how to do anything if you had the right political views. And so his army, to attack the party, all the bureaucrats, all the intellectuals, all the officials, were Red Guards. These young people that he would instigate into a frenzy in Tiananmen Square through these speeches. They would go out there and stand there for a day or two waiting for him. He galvanized them to attack their parents, to attack their educational institutions, close down factories, and attack the party, and reinstate him alone.
Teachers were the first to be attacked. Even small children were encouraged to betray traitors. Suddenly the young had enormous power over their elders if they obeyed the party line. After the pictures of the millions of Red Guards waving Mao's book, perhaps the second most well-known image of the Cultural Revolution is that of their victims being paraded through the streets on their way to struggle sessions.
The struggle sessions were designed to rile up the masses. So, of course, there were a lot of theatricality to it. It usually started with the Red Guards or the revolutionaries going to a person's home or his office and drag this person out onto the street, put a dunce cap on their head and put a placard on their neck on which it will be written some type of a verdict against them. Oftentimes put on a truck and go through a public parade so that, you know, maximum number of people would see them being humiliated, and then they will be brought to a auditorium of some sort, put on stage where the audience will yell out slogans, and they are often beaten, and they often are forced to confess some crime.
The struggle session was, in reality, more of an opportunity for the revolutionaries to fling abuse at the victim and sharpen their command of Mao's rhetoric. No one was immune. Zhi Lijiang, whose family was part of a theater company, was instructed to denounce her father.
The revolutionaries from my father's theater, one day they came to my school. In front of my teachers and school leaders, they told me they want me to denounce my father in a struggle meeting. I was supposed to stand on stage too, facing hundreds of people to condemn him for his crime.
Zhi Lijiang avoided going to the meeting, but the Red Guard condemned her father in her absence. By 1969, Chinese society had all but ground to a halt.
There were no courts. You know, if somebody died, it was very hard even to get them buried. The hospitals were basically non-functional. All the schools closed. Young people were roaming all around the country in gangs with red armbands on, linking up with each other and having revolutionary experiences. Millions came into Beijing, had to be fed, they had to be housed. They were creating revolution. This, of course, just completely upended the economy and finally had to be brought to an end. And it brought to an end as the Red Guards themselves started fighting amongst each other very violently, killing each other.
Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people were killed in the early days of the Cultural Revolution. Later on, when the Red Guards started to fight amongst themselves, hundreds of thousands more perished.
I was in the Hong Kong Consul General from 68 to 70, and this is the height of the Cultural Revolution, which is north of Canton. They had a huge factional battle in which people were executed by the winning side. They took them and they put their hands behind their back and shot them, pushed them in the river. And these bodies floated down into Hong Kong. We could see them floating down, floating down, floating down.
Now, pieces of the story are coming out in recently published documents and the covert writings of former party bosses. The current most conservative estimate is that 500,000 people lost their lives in the Cultural Revolution. Other estimates put that number in the low millions.
You got a sense of the raw struggle, the brutality of this struggle by these bodies coming in. Millions were probably killed in the Cultural Revolution through factional fighting, through the military crackdown, through the persecution of the so-called intelligentsia. We don't know how many were killed.
No one will ever know exactly. Society had broken down. Records were not kept. There is no way of finding out how many people died. But after the chaos subsided, China had to find a way to recover. New hope was on the horizon, in the form of a new ally for Chairman Mao. He was an odd partner for the old revolutionary, one of America's fiercest anti-communists, and he was visiting China to witness the final act of Mao's own revolutionary saga. (1969). The Cultural Revolution had cost perhaps millions of Chinese citizens and peasants their lives. And although it had restored Chairman Mao Zedong and his wife Jiang Qing to power, they ruled the country in chaos.
He also soon realized that this could not last forever. He ultimately needs somebody to bring things back to normalcy. More so, he realized that if he doesn't do that, his credibility with the people will plummet.
1971. Mao's chosen successor, Lin Biao, the chief of the army, was also unhappy. He felt he had not been granted enough power. Recently declassified documents point to the fact that Lin's wife, not unlike Madame Mao, was ambitious and was plotting an assassination attempt against the chairman.
They were a little overzealous, perhaps, in promoting Lin Biao, and this tipped Mao off. So he went around the country, met with local military leaders, and alerted them that a conspiracy is underfoot. And they had set up explosives as well as airstrike plans to essentially blow up Mao's train.
Lin Biao's family believed that Mao would halt his train in the evening in order to get a good night's sleep.
Here is again, Mao showed his very, very sharp political acumen. He, that night, decided not to stop. So that assassination was never carried out.
Exposed, Lin Biao and his family fled toward the USSR. Mysteriously, the plane crashed, killing all on board. Recently declassified Soviet documents tell part of the story.
They concluded that there was no evidence of a missile or any other form of explosion. But the most interesting and perhaps most theatrical fact they revealed was that at the time of the crash, the plane was heading back toward China.
The last moments of the assassination plotters will forever remain an enigma.
It was the first public indication that even within Chairman Mao's clique, there was dissent, there was power mongering, that people were scheming.
At least one steady, loyal ally remained, the Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. He had managed to hold on to just sufficient power and trust to slowly right the ship of state, using the still loyal People's Liberation Army, or PLA.
People get to Mao and say, this has to stop. And he orders the PLA in to put the lid on. And they start cracking down with a vengeance. And then the key thing comes when Zhou Enlai brings back Deng Xiaoping.
There was an even more surprising secret ally waiting in the wings.
There had been no diplomatic contact between the United States and China for nearly 20 years, since 1954.
The United States trusted China even less than it trusted the USSR. But National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai formed a clandestine partnership that would permit their two leaders to come together in peace.
Zhou Enlai was a remarkable personality. He was one of the most charming people I have ever met. Extraordinarily intelligent, extraordinarily patient. The interesting aspect of our relationship was, since there had been no diplomatic contact, there was nothing really to talk about of the normal diplomatic exchanges. So we had to talk about important subjects. There was nothing else to talk about.
Dr. Kissinger's covert visit laid the groundwork for the diplomatic coup that President Richard Nixon will be remembered for. February the 21st, 1972. Nixon, the ferocious anti-communist, flew to China. A journalist, Helen Thomas, went with the Nixon entourage as part of the White House press corps.
Like landing on the moon. It was so barren. There were no people there except for the official greeters.
The Chinese were also in the dark. Nixon, for them, was the great enemy of their time. For years, Red Guards had used a straw dummy with Nixon's face on it for their daily bayonet practice.
And all of a sudden, I realized that's the American president. That's the one that was on my dummy, the image. And the instant automatic reaction was, Shah! And here I'm saying, welcome, welcome, and in my head was a completely different thing. I was shocked. And I believe this happened to everybody who recognized him.
The visit was a triumph for everyone concerned. President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger counted it among their greatest achievements, and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and his more pragmatic colleagues like Deng Xiaoping were able to begin to think about rapprochement with the West.
There was a great turning point in our history, that it's better to be friends than go to war. There was a great sense of relief that we made a friend, and that it was possible to be friendly with a communist state.
And Dr. Kissinger gained an insight into one of the most nimble political minds of the 20th century.
Almost every other statesman I know would say, I've got 4 points to make. Mao wouldn't do that. He would begin a conversation and say, what do you think of whatever? Then whatever you said, he would say, but have you considered the following aspect? It would go on like this, sometimes for hours. Here was a man who killed millions of people in pursuit of his fanatical ideology. But what he did was he separated his fanatic ideology for domestic reasons from foreign policy, where he was sort of a cold-blooded Machiavellian.
When Richard Nixon went to China, it was astounding. Of course, he was the only U.S. president who could go because he was so right-wing that no one would even think that he was a communist sympathizer. So he had the credentials to pull it off. It meant that it was the end of China's isolation as a kingdom that was completely closed to the outside world. It was the beginning of a new era in China.
But in late 1972, Madame Mao and her faction, which came to be known as the Gang of Four, were continuing to plot to replace Mao.
These four, for their own political purposes, banded together. The term Gang of Four was actually coined by Mao himself. Mao at various times had told these people, do not be a gang. But of course, on the other hand, he's also indirectly supported many of their policies and decisions.
September the 9th, 1976. Mao Zedong died of congestive heart failure at the age of 83. With him died the last embers of the Cultural Revolution.
Within a few weeks, the whole place fell apart. It all blew up. His coterie of close supporters suddenly became labeled the Gang of Four. All these people that I thought everyone liked, turns out they all hated. They all hated Madame Mao.
Madame Mao's downfall was swift and sharp.
Deng had been purged by Mao earlier in the year, and he was cooling his heels in South China, but he had the army supporting him. And within 3 weeks, Jiang Qing was arrested, and the military, with Deng as their candidate, were the reason for this.
The members of the Gang of Four were put on trial. Madame Mao remained to the end ferocious, arrogant, and defiant.
Jiang Qing didn't have a chance. In Chinese culture, historically, with the empress, it was normal to blame the leader's shortcomings on some evil woman.
Jiang Qing was condemned to death, but her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She died in 1991, apparently by suicide. The power that Mao achieved in life lives on after his passing. His body remains on display, preserved as it was at the moment of his death. He is a hero of truly epic stature, the warrior leader who has steered his great nation through the turbulent waters of the violent 20th century. Mao Zedong is now more than a man. He is a legend and a demigod in the vast land of China.